Hey there. Ever feel like the world's debating capitalism right outside your window? Well, today, we're joining that debate. You've given us some fascinating sources on this very topic, and we're going deep on whether capitalism is the best system we've got, or if it needs, like, a serious overhaul.
Yeah, it's a debate that gets people fired up, that's for sure. Which is why we're here to break it all down. No side taking here, just equipping you with the arguments and the evidence so you can decide for yourself.
Love it. So, capitalism. When we say that word, what are we even talking about?
Your sources point to a few key things. Free markets, where businesses got to compete with each other, private ownership of companies, resources, that kind of thing. And of course, consumerism. Can't forget that.
Right, that old buy engine. But the sources that defend capitalism, they say it's not just about shopping sprees. It's about driving progress, innovation, that sort of thing.
Exactly. They argue that competition between businesses, it's like this engine. It pushes everyone to come up with new ideas, better products, and ultimately that leads to a stronger economy overall. And it's not just talk either. Your sources bring up data from the World Economic Forum. And their research shows that countries with more capitalist economies, they DO, tend to have more technological advancements, higher productivity.
So, like, necessity is the mother of invention, but playing out on a global scale.
Exact.
I could see that. It's like your sources even use Apple and Google as examples. Those companies kind of exploded under a capitalist system.
They did. And they wouldn't be the giants they are today without that pressure that need to constantly innovate, stay ahead of the competition. But, and this is where it gets tricky, it's not all sunshine and roses, is it?
Definitely not. Your sources get into some of the big criticisms of capitalism. And income inequality is a huge one. Because it's one thing to have competition, but it's another if the gap between the haves and the have-nots gets too big.
It's a huge GE issue. And again, it's not just people complaining the data's there. Your source cites the International Monetary Fund. They've done the research, and their findings show that capitalist economies, more often than not, DO, have a wider gap between the richest and poorest citizens. So yes, some people are thriving, but others are really struggling just to get by.
Man, that's tough to think about. And your sources, they seem to link this inequality to corporate power, which, yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? The more powerful companies get, the more they can kind of influence the system in their favor.
Exactly. One argument is that as corporations get bigger and bigger in a capitalist system, they can actually end up stifling the very competition that's supposed to be capitalism's strength, which can then lead to monopolies. And your source actually brings up a study by the Global Economic Reform Panel on this very issue. They found that this kind of unchecked corporate power, it ends up hurting both consumers because now they have fewer choices. A&D workers get hit with stagnant wages, fewer job options, all because a few big players are calling the shots.
Wow. So the system that's supposed to reward competition can actually undermine itself if a few powerful companies rig the game.
That's the argument some people are making, yeah.
That's a pretty big deal. And what about this whole consumerism thing? Is our constant need to buy, B-U-Y, actually good for society in the long run?
That's where your source material takes us from pure economics into, like, deeper questions about values. It argues that a system that's so focused on buying stuff might actually be working against things like social welfare, environmental sustainability, the things that a more equitable system, as your source puts it, would actually prioritize.
Right, because those things like a clean environment, a strong social safety net, those aren't always profitable, are they? So are
Yeah.
we talking about getting rid of capitalism completely, or can you actually reform it, change it from within to address these issues?
That is the question. And you know what? Your sources actually present both sides of the argument. On one hand, you have people who believe in reform, not revolution. They think capitalism can be a force for good, but we need to be smarter about it, more thoughtful in how we approach it.
Okay, so what does that look like? What kind of reforms are we talking about here?
Well, they point to some analysis done by the World Bank. And the World Bank suggests that capitalist economies can create a more level playing field if they have strong regulations and social safety nets in place. Think things like stronger consumer protections, making healthcare and education more affordable, basically things that benefit everyone, not just those at the very top.
Makes sense. But how do you pay for all that?
That's where taxing the highest earners comes in.
Ah, okay. So using the system's wealth-generating power to create a more equitable society, I get it. But I have a feeling those who want to completely end the OW system would say that's just putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem.
Oh, absolutely. They'd say it's like trying to fix a broken leg with a Band-Aid. You need a more radical solution.
All right, let's get radical then.
Yeah.
What's the alternative vision? What are we talking about here?
Well, your source material doesn't really dive into like specific systems, but it does give us a sense of what the goals are. One big idea is a more equitable distribution of wealth. So it's not just about profits, it's about making sure everyone benefits from economic progress. And actually, one of your sources looks at Islamic economic models as a potential alternative framework.
Yeah, I remember that one. It talks about aiming for a just and equitable life. But what does that actually look like?
So it emphasizes this idea of balance, like finding a balance between making a profit and being socially and environmentally responsible. It's less about that every man for himself mentality and more about like shared prosperity.
Yeah, I get that.
And here's the thing. Your sources actually point to real-world examples where these alternative models have actually worked, which suggests that, hey, maybe there's a different way of doing things. Maybe there's a different way of structuring an economy that's possible.
That's wild. It's not just theoretical then. There's actual evidence to back it up. Makes you think.
Right. Have we been, like, too stuck in one way of thinking about economics for too long?
It's a good question.
But before we get too far down that road, what about the people who say, nope, capitalism's still the best system we've got, flaws and all? What are their big arguments? They often point to capitalism's track record. Like, it's hard to argue with its ability to generate wealth, to drive innovation. And your source material, especially the work of the economist Berger, he really emphasizes this.
Yeah, Berger seems pretty convinced that capitalism's the best system for, as he puts it, providing goods to large populations.
Exactly. He argues that historically no other system has been as effective at, meeting the material needs of so many people.
Right.
And he's got a point. Capitalism has lifted millions out of poverty over time.
It's true.
It's hard to ignore that impact.
It's that whole a rising tide lifts all boats argument, right? But does it really lift all the boats or just some more than others?
That seems to be the core tension here, doesn't it?
It really does.
And even Berger, who's a big defender of capitalism, even Ed admits that its success isn't guaranteed. He actually warns about some potential negative side effects that could actually outweigh capitalism's successes if we're not careful.
Oh, wow. So even HE has reservations. That's interesting. What kind of side effects are we talking about here?
Well, he's pretty blunt about it. He points to the potential for inequality, for environmental damage, even for social unrest. He says these are major risks if capitalism isn't, like, managed carefully.
Wow.
It's almost like he's, outlining the very critiques that some of your other sources are making, the reasons they're even considering alternatives in the first place.
That is interesting. So even capitalism's biggest fans recognize that it's not perfect. It's not this flawless system. It seems like anything, no matter how successful, is going to have its downsides.
Right.
It's about weighing those pros and cons, I guess.
Exactly.
And speaking of cons, your sources really dig into the human cost, like the human cost of prioritizing profit above all else. There's this phrase that pops up. The doctrine of the bottom line.
Ooh, yeah.
And it sounds kind of ominous, honestly. What's the story there?
So this is from Lewis Lapham. We talked about him a bit earlier. And he argues that capitalism, it can kind of trap us. It can trap us in a mindset where profit is the ultimate goal, even if it means sacrificing our morals, our ethics.
Right.
The system itself can erode our values if we're not careful.
So as long as you're making money, it doesn't really matter how you get there, right?
Yeah, taken to the extreme, that's the risk.
Yeah.
And this ties into a broader critique of capitalism, this idea that it encourages individualism. It's all about competition, you versus me, instead of cooperation, instead of thinking about the collective good.
Right, like the classic dog-eat-dog world mentality.
Exactly. But remember those alternative models we talked about before? Like those Islamic economic principles, for example.
Yeah.
They offer a totally different perspective.
I do. They're all about social justice, ethical conduct, like those things matter alongside profit.
Exactly.
It's less about squeezing every penny out of, every transaction and more about creating a system where everyone has the chance to like genuinely thrive. Which, honestly, is kind of refreshing to hear, especially compared to that whole greed is good mentality that we see sometimes.
It is refreshing, isn't it?
It really is.
And your source material highlights how these alternative models, they challenge that me versus you thing that capitalism can sometimes create. They propose a more we're all in this together approach, like our economic systems, they should work for everyone, not just a select few.
It really makes you think, like we've been told this story about how a rising tide lifts all boats. But what if some people are starting out with yachts and others are barely clinging to driftwood?
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It is.
And your sources, they suggest this isn't about just like tweaking the system a little. It's about a much bigger shift, like how we think about the whole purpose of an economy.
Right, like, is it just about making as much money as possible,
Exactly.
even if it means, sacrificing the environment, social
And
well-being?
can we imagine something different?
Yeah. A system that actually values things like, I don't know, sustainability,
Mm.
equity, even happiness, alongside profits.
It's like choosing between two different maps for the future, right?
It really is. One map, it's all about profit no matter the cost. The other, it's about like well-being for everyone.
And sometimes I wonder if we've been so busy following that first map, the profit map, that we've forgotten there are even other possibilities out there.
It's like we've lost our imagination a little bit.
Maybe. And that's what I find so interesting about your source material, It doesn't just lay out the arguments for and against capitalism. It's like it's asking you a question. What kind of world do you want to live in?
It's a call to action disguised as a deep dive.
There you go.
Instead of just accepting things as they are, it's like, hey, what if we actually demanded something better?
Exactly. And your sources, they point to this growing movement of people who are like done. They're done with an economic system that puts profit over people, over the planet.
It's about taking back the narrative, remembering that WE have the power to shape these systems, to
Wow.
create a world that actually reflects our values.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole conversation so exciting, I think. It's not about having all the answers. It's about having the tool to ask the right questions.
Right. So to everyone listening, don't just take our word for it. We've barely scratched the surface here.
Yeah, dive into those sources yourselves.
Do your own research. And most importantly, never stop questioning.
Never stop questioning the systems that shape our world.
Because, let's be honest, the future kind of depends on it, doesn't it?
It really does.
Engaged citizens, people who are willing to, challenge assumptions
Yeah.
and demand better.
That's how we move forward.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the nuts and bolts of how capitalism works to these really different ways of thinking about economics.
It's been quite the journey.
It has. And we hope, honestly, that this is just the beginning of a much bigger conversation.
Absolutely.
So until next time,
Keep asking those tough questions.
keep pushing for a more just, a more equitable world.
You got it.
And hey, who knows? Maybe, just maybe, we can create a future where a rising tide really does lift all boats.
I like it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everybody.